Hi, my name is Tina Odu.
My name is Eleanor Hogan. We're social work apprentices pursuing bachelors in social work in the United Kingdom. Welcome to the Decolonising Social Work Field Education podcast.
Through this podcast, we invite you to think about how we can decolonize social work field education. We've heard about social justice from the very start of our social work training. In fact, before we even started our training, we were expected to know the concepts of social justice and human rights and reflect this in our application and interviews.
While we learned a lot about social justice in our syllabus, we're encouraged to think about anti-discriminatory and anti-oppressive practice in everything we do, how we write case notes, how we introduce ourselves to the people we work with, and how societal structures and systems can further oppress and marginalise people, even through technology, for example.
Yes, but amongst all, one framework that stayed with me, especially in relation to social justice, is the Adams framework, which covers a justice as process, justice as content, and justice as pedagogy. This framework also is covered in our recent scoping review, which we have read, and it's a fantastic, wholesome approach towards understanding justice as a whole. Which brings us to our today's conversation with our host, Dr. Michael Wallengren Lynch, and our guest. Any guesses? Dr. Taskeen Adam herself. Let's hear about her framework on social justice and much more in today's episode, which is Understanding Adam's Decolonial and Social Justice Framework in Field Education.
My name is Michael Wallengren Lynch, and I'm a senior lecturer in social work at Malmö University, Sweden. Originally from Ireland, I've been living in Sweden since 2009, when my research interests focused on decolonial ideas and their relevance to social work in the Nordic countries. I first encountered the work of today's guest while collaborating with the team behind this podcast series. Her framework on justice as process, justice as content, and justice as... A warm welcome to Taskeen Adams. Taskeen, perhaps you'd like to start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. So a bit about myself. I'm actually an engineer by training, but I delved into the world of development studies and education, and then moved on to look more in technology and decoloniality and social justice, trying to understand that, looking at the impacts of technology on education, the good, the bad, the ugly. We'll delve into it more through the podcast. I won't say too much upfront right now.
Okay. Very teasing us with the good, the bad, the ugly. We'll hopefully address all those three as we go along. I came across a very interesting citation from a historian from the US called Melvin Kranzberg in the 80s, where he proposed these 6 laws to technology. And the first law he was fascinated by is the idea is technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. What would you think about that? Would you agree with that? Is that why we're maybe talking about decolonialism and technology, thinking about AI? So what would you think about that statement?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to start off. And a lot of people look at technology as something that's neutral. But there's a specific quote by Kluwen, I think, and it's called "The medium is the message." And it talks more about like how when technology is brought in, it's not just a tool, but it actually shapes and changes society. Just when the printing press came in and printed media, it changed how we understood. It changed society from something that was predominantly oral to something written. At the same time, TV, how we find information, how we learn, it's all shaped. So pedagogies, epistemologies, ontologies, all are shaped by this technology. Even AI has almost taken us as a step change and shift in how we think and how we do things. So I definitely don't think it's neutral. I think there's often people would look to technology as, oh, it's like a hammer. You can use it to do something good or you can use it to harm someone. But I actually heard in another podcast recently, someone comparing AI to a fire, and a fire can be used to warm someone else, warm us up, but it can also create a wildfire and spread. So it can be, the danger can be disproportional to the benefit in some cases.
We know there's many definitions and understanding of what decolonialism means. It would be interesting to hear a bit about how you approached it, what you've learned from it, how you, maybe if you're applying it to the world of AI, how we are to maybe critically reflect on how AI can be both good, bad, and ugly. Maybe say a little bit more about some of these kind of key terms and ideas.
Thanks for that. I love starting off with definitions because they help make a whole conversation much clearer. So I think we talk about decolonization, but like we can first start with colonization, right? And most often people look to colonization as understanding it as a political and economic relation where one nation is controlling and exerting power and political and economic power over another nation. And then the idea of decolonization would be when this country or this nation is emancipated. And so that's what we saw in the formal definition in the mid 20th century. Many colonies were emancipated politically and I would say somewhat economically, although that's under contestation. But here, I think probably what the terms that I like to use to shift from colonization and decolonization is coloniality and decoloniality, because colonization can often be confused with an end goal. Now we have decolonized, we have achieved this, whereas coloniality and decoloniality would emphasize more the process as something that's ongoing. So there's never really an end point. So I guess just to unpack coloniality and decoloniality, coloniality then, like it refers to these like long-standing patterns of power as a result of colonialism. So it would impact how we think, how we act, our culture, what we understand as knowledge production. If we had to draw on Latin American scholars, they look at the coloniality of knowledge, the coloniality of being, and the coloniality of power. And so when we look at decoloniality, we look at this as this process of removing these colonial legacies. And that, to use a definition of Maldonado Torres, he said the dismantling of relations of power and conceptions of knowledge that have fomented the reproduction of like racial, gender, geopolitical hierarchies. And that's how, they're formed in this kind of this new modern colonial world. And then taking the next step, you asked about AI as well. So a lot of my research takes this groundwork from these Latin American and African scholars on decoloniality and looks at it in the digital space. And so I use this term digital neocolonialism, and I defined it in my research as like the use of information technology or the internet and now even AI as part of all of this. The use of this by hegemonic powers to have a means of indirect control over, it could be a marginalized group or a country. And then in this kind of model, it's no longer one country controlling another country, but it could be a corporate or international institution that can exert this power, whether through data colonialism, cyber colonialism. It's also termed techno-capitalism in some cases.
Based on that series of arguments, would you agree or would you say that coloniality so is an ongoing process in this modern world, as you referred to it with? Is AI an extension of coloniality, or is it something else?
So coloniality, I definitely do think is something that is ongoing because we've shifted our powers, right? It might not just be about land anymore, right? But it could be about data. There's still control and there's still economic power being exerted by, I would not say countries anymore. I would say some groups, because we've moved into more of a techno-capitalist space. But to bring in more current affairs, we see like the reduction of, like foreign aid was also critiqued as this indirect control. And now in the latest changes with US aid and UK aid, we see a reduction maybe in one country's indirect control in another, but an increase in techno-capitalism where different for-profit companies or big tech are increasingly exerting their power. And sometimes it comes with good and bad, and then I said the ugly as well. So yeah, for good and bad, there's that shift from, I would say, countries to institutes or corporations. And and that is definitely empowered by the tech backing, particularly in education, where it can come across as like the savior mentality of techno-determinism, where technology is going to come in and solve the problems that couldn't be solved before.
Yeah, the new religion, the modern religions. So I guess if we're thinking, this is what you presented is maybe a mix of good, bad, and the ugly. And if we're saying decolonialism or decoloniality is very widely used, I mean, it's been more popular now in the social work space. What can that offer this type of world that you're describing, this techno-capitalist world where data capitalism is the driving force? What can decoloniality actually practically offer in this, if we're thinking about education, social work?
Yeah, so maybe I can take you through my framework to understand a bit more how I unpack decoloniality and the understanding of it, maybe in relation to social justice. So I draw on like decolonial frameworks and social justice frameworks. So decolonial frameworks from more the global south that focus on like dismantling the sources that have caused injustices, and then social justice frameworks that were more developed in the global north that have taken either ameliorative or transformative steps towards addressing injustices. And so in my framework, I look at cultural epistemic injustices. So this relates to dominant concepts of knowledge that could exclude differing histories of values, narratives, and worldviews. Then I look at material injustices, which is normally when people talk about justice, they normally first jump to this, looking at access and use issues, looking at resource, infrastructure, socioeconomic injustices, and then we look at the political and geopolitical injustices. So this, like Maldonado Torres emphasized, could be how the power dynamics basically that underlie different race, class, sexual, gender, geographic, or spiritual hierarchies. So those are the lenses of analysis that I use to tackle the space. And I think what's really useful is once you have the words to describe the injustice, it becomes so much easier to then pinpoint these.
I think that's what we took from that's another paper that's where you spoke about justice as process, content, and pedagogy. Maybe can you say something about how those relate to this, what you just spoke about the cultural, I guess, epistemologies? Is that a development of your thought, or is it in another word, or how they link together?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess just taking a step back first, when I was trying to understand it, and I'm probably just talking through this as a journey, like looking at decoloniality and social justice, there were many like different and complex and competing understandings of these words. And what I found was like in developing that framework is that it was easier to just talk about the injustice. It's easier to hone in clearly on what the problem is because different people apply different solutions, which it can sometimes even cause further injustices. In one of my papers, I look at decoloniality versus social justice, and I look at 3 processes which can help us to strive for justice, right? And this is within the education or online education space. There's justice as content, justice as process, and justice as pedagogy. So in my research, I was working with MOOC, massive open online course designers, and trying to understand how they understood decoloniality and social justice and how they tried, if at all, to incorporate it into their courses. With that context in mind, justice as content was where we looked at decolonizing what is taught, right? So this could be in the materials and the text and the discussions and the assessments or examples of feedback. And it aimed to understand and bring about different perspectives. For example, if you're working within a local community, working with their context and indigenous knowledges or things that are rooted within that space. So that was justice as content. Then justice as process, here it was decolonizing the process. So how something is designed, how a course curriculum is designed, how assessment happens, how content is formed. And here it's all about relational processes. So for example, including students in this process, co-creating with students, thinking of different forms of assessment. Then the third one was justice as pedagogy. And here we're looking at how we can encourage students to critically engage or reflect or even challenge what is being taught. So challenge the teacher, have that really critical discussion. And yeah, it's about being able to bring that critical reflexivity into the space. Both the learner and the teacher understand their power differences and how that could impact how they view the world and how they approach the course that they're taking.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially about the importance of it also being a reflective journey for the teacher. That's there, and that also requires maybe a deconstruction of roles or perceptions of roles in education, or if it's in a practice teacher, student setting when students are in placement, or even in an education setting. One thing I'm curious about before we move on to more kind of practical questions about you positioned, you said versus decolonialism versus social justice. And I'm wondering, is there a risk about using these terms interchangeably? Do we feel some terms are overused? We've diluted certain meanings? Like, as social workers maybe grappling existentially with ideas of social justice, and have we really delivered on that? And some people would say we haven't at all. And so how is there a danger of these terms being overused?
I definitely do. So I think both terms can have many meanings, and if used incorrectly or just thrown around or used in a whitewashed way, they can actually reinforce injustices. I guess just to give you a little bit of a deep dive into my thinking, when I research social justice frameworks, like I mentioned, many of them, actually all of them, the term comes from the global north, right? And from Kant and Mills over time to more recent works of Nussbaum and Sandel, all of them each has their own understanding of that. And many, like I mentioned, start off with redistributive justices, right? And that's about reallocation of resources. But more recent frameworks bring in recognitive justices, which is more about respecting culture and difference, and representational justices, which is about equitable representation. So social justice itself has had a history, first focusing on justice within your nation versus more recent understandings of global justice frameworks. So there's a shift. And if you look, I think, again, past 2015, after decolonial movement started, social justice even took a decolonial turn and started to look more at the sources of systematic oppression rather than the consequences of systematic oppression, which was first what social justice addressed, the consequences. Now, similarly, decolonial movements can also risk reinforcing injustices if they've not been dealt with appropriately. I think I love to use Jonathan Jansen's work here as he highlights some of this in like the African context. For example, one interpretation of decolonization might be Africanization, where you take the curriculum and you replace everything that's European with something that's local and indigenous. But here we we run the risk of nativism or localization being co-opted for political or national agendas. And it also doesn't really acknowledge hybrid identities that are now formed between us, maybe natives. We evolve over time, and we can't be dated to something that was from the 1900s or even before that. So we evolve as a nation as well. Another example might be Afrocentrism, where it's okay, we're not going to reject everything European, but we're going to recenter things. But this even has its problems because it might not be about taking the best, acknowledging that even local or indigenous knowledges are not infallible, right? So they also need to be open to critical engagement and discussion. Just as a third example, Jansen also talks about knowledge as entanglement. And here it's a different view. So it's understanding that knowledge evolves over time and it's inseparable from regions because knowledge is evolving, and it's what we know and how we know it through interaction with different spaces and cultures, and that help us transform. And so it sounds like the answer, but then it also stands the risk of like knowledge is written by the victor, and those marginalized knowledges don't get carried in this process. So nothing is perfect, and we have to keep on being critical even when we think we achieving some sort of justice.
An answer, and there's so much in that for sure. And I love that idea about entangled knowledge and this kind of almost whole post-humanist idea. And I guess then there's the question, how does something like social work in practice and in teaching ensure that these marginalized voices are represented, heard, engaged with in these, I guess you're focused on these online spaces, but how do we navigate this enormous complexity?
I think one aspect that I would probably emphasize is the importance of, within the social work education, building the capacity to deal with difference. And this is something that we see in our current state right now, is an increase in polarized views and perspectives. Like the world is just somehow becoming so polarized. And I do think that technology and algorithms are feeding that, right? Based on, it's not the only source for sure, but a very big source is you're shaped by what you see and what you hear. And as these algorithms try to feed you what you want to hear, it creates these polarizations of perspectives. And so as social workers, we need to encourage engaging and supporting people who might have different ideas, but also having people who are being supported also feeling open to sharing their different ideologies or perspectives or problems. In your paper, you talk about like land conflicts and how that is such a difficult concept. But it might, like this sort of idea of like Western ideologies seeping into everything, it might not be super political. Maybe just to give you a personal anecdote, when I was in university, I attended university counseling as a Muslim woman. And I wasn't married yet. And I was expressing this to the counselor, right? Trying to understand like, oh, I'm going for a PhD, but I'm not married yet. And as I was saying this, I just felt these Western ideologies or norms weighing down on me that, oh, I'm not feminist. Why do I care so much from my cultural background? This is not normal. And it was just like this conflicting feeling that my counselor is going to be judging me because this ideal norm is to be this empowered woman that doesn't need to get married. So all of these clashes, sorry to ramble, but all of these clashes, to be a good counselor means to be able to make a space for someone to not feel judged or misunderstood in those spaces. This is your space. You know best how to address those challenges. But I think dealing with difference, it has always been a topic in social justice, in social work. But I feel like these differences are now way more polarized. Just to jump, you also asked about the digital space. And like my response there is just that I would encourage as much as possible to keep things as in person as possible. And I say this because like education is just something that like it really does need mentorship and empathy and care and interest and use of body language and modeling, role models, physical interaction, kinesthetics. These are all like hidden parts of education that we don't quite realize how are really important to the teaching and learning process.
Sure, and it's great that you also lifted the word empowerment because it kind of moves on to my last question. And I'm wondering about how do you see empowerment as something which is still has resonance and meaning in it to support people in this highly techno-capitalist world driven by algorithms and AI and data capitalism and so forth. Do you feel there's this role there still for this kind of relationality and based on ideas of empowerment?
Yeah, so I'm not completely pessimistic. There's definitely many benefits to using tech or edtech and AI in ways that are empowering. A term I learned recently was like the understanding of like learnification. As learning shifts online, there's a bigger focus on datafication of learning. So understanding how we can view learning as bite-sized chunks to then track and progress learning. So this like learnification, and we so focus on the process that we might lose sight of the content and the purpose and the relationships involved in education. We always have to come back to the purpose of education, how it can inculcate goodness and justice in man as an individual and as a member of society. And that links so much to social work, right? Education is a social act, right? And we talk about social work here. Like it's so embedded in communities. And so it can't just be replaced by machines. So I think the current bandwagon that I'm on is making sure that people understand that education is not just an intellectual pursuit. It's something that includes the heart and the soul. And if we reduce it to just an intellectual pursuit, then we're really doing a huge disservice to generations to come.
Wonderful, wonderful final words, I think, there. And it really just encapsulates and you really highlighted the good, bad, and ugly. And it really invites us to kind of really connect what you're saying to, or at least the people who are listening, the social work students who are listening to the podcast, to how this makes the sense for them and in their kind of social work experience. So I really would like to thank you for participating. Taskeen, it was great to listen and to get to understand a little bit more of your thoughts and where all this is going. From us, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
That was an intriguing conversation about social justice. I love frameworks as I find them really useful in breaking down complex subjects. And we have had an endless list of frameworks in our social work studies, haven't we, Eleanor?
Absolutely. I really like that Adam said, so education is a social act. Many people with low social and economic statuses are encouraged to go into work rather than higher education. And I think that making higher education a reachable goal for more people can help fight these social injustices and promote social change.
I agree. Colonialism and the impacts is still very much an ongoing process in today's world.
I agree. Socio-economical injustices are felt largely with the people that I work with on placement, which is in a small seaside town in a deprived area. As social workers, we are encouraged to promote social change and the well-being of the people we work with. Using frameworks like this can help support that.
Absolutely. I feel really emboldened that I can approach the subject of social justice and coloniality or colonialism using Adam's framework, which kind of feels like a foolproof approach, in my opinion.
As social workers, we will always be learning, even when we had finished our training. We invite you to think critically wherever you are on your social work journey. You've been listening to the Decolonising Social Work Field Education podcast, Global Dialogues for Change, an international participatory project with students, experts by experience, practitioners and academics, funded by the European Association of Schools of Social Work, led by Associate Professor Heng Lien Lisa Chen at the University of Sussex, and co-produced by Mitali Kulkarni. Visit dialogueswfe.org and follow us online. Decolonising social work starts with you. Stay tuned.